Hello. Today I'll be reading 3 stories about children who go exploring into the woods and each time finding something they probably wish they hadn't found. All these are original stories that are told to me firsthand by the people who experienced them. Enjoy. The Tunnel. When I was a child, I used to love going to my grandma's house out in the country. We lived in a more urban area, so it was quite a treat to be away from civilization for a while. Or that's kinda how I saw it. I got to see my cousins, who all lived out in the country as well, and there was so much to do that was different than usual. My grandma lived in a small hollow with heavily forested hills that we all enjoyed exploring. We would often get lost on purpose and just see how long it took us to find our way back home. Not long after my 12th birthday, my parents took us for a trip to see Grandma. It was in the early fall, which was my favorite time to visit, and my favorite time to explore. I love when it's cold enough outside that you have to wear a jacket, but not a coat yet. And I love the sound of the scrunching and crunching of leaves as they're crushed under my feet. Not to mention that with autumn there's that wonderful smell that comes when the trees are barren, carried by a chilly breeze. Well, on this particular visit, my cousins Jessica and Phil, who were about the same age as me, were eager to go out and explore. We all set out at afternoon, immediately after we had our lunch. It didn't take very long until we all got lost. After a while and a lot of exploring, we eventually found our way to a gravel road that none of us were familiar with. Interested in seeing where it led, we followed it but stayed on the side of it. We were always careful not to walk in the road just in case a car came by and didn't see us. A lot of times people driving on country gravel roads are pretty careless about their driving habits. Well, eventually, walking along the road, we came up to a small bridge. It was one of those bridges that was really just a part of the road, with a big metal tunnel underneath it. It was obviously just put there because it was a small creek and it was allowing the creek to run through. "Hey, do you want to go to the tunnel?" Phil asked me. "Yeah, it sounds like fun," I agreed. "Let's see how fast we can run through it. Last one there is a rotten egg." And yes, I really said that. All 3 of us began to run off the side of the road, and we were approaching the tunnel. Before we got there, though, we were surprised when a human hand and head popped out from inside the tunnel. We stopped in our tracks and looked at the man before us. He was an older, scruffy man who looked like he hadn't bathed in forever. And he was actually wearing what looked like an old and very dirty top hat. His beard was gray and unkempt. He was wearing a jacket that was a really dirty brown tweed. When he saw the 3 of us, he smiled a grin that likely had about 3 teeth in it. "Hey kids, you wanna play with my dogs?" he asked immediately and quite excitedly. Well, none of us were sure what to do. Of course, our parents had always told us that we shouldn't talk to strangers. However, they also told us we should always show our elders respect. And this man was definitely an elder. Now, while it might seem that his appearance should have put us off, it really didn't. We had plenty of relatives who really didn't look much better than he did. Now, being that I was the one who usually took charge, I decided to answer him. "No, that's okay," I told him. "We're just outside exploring and really should be getting back to our grandma's house." "Are you lost?" the man asked us, still smiling. He was still mostly standing inside the tunnel, and all we could really see was his head and the arm that was holding the side of the tunnel as he leaned out. "No, we were just hiking," I replied. I knew enough that you never let a stranger know you were lost. The man just looked at us. still smiling that toothless smile. And he repeated his question. "Do you want to play with my dogs?" We all looked at each other. Of course, we were very uncomfortable at this point. I was feeling very nervous in my stomach, but I didn't really want the others to know that. I knew we all wanted to leave, but we were taught to show respect for our elders, and he wasn't ready to let us leave yet. When none of us answered him, the man kept smiling, and he repeated his question. "Do you want to play with my dogs?" Well, not knowing what else to do, Jessica asked him, "Well, how many dogs do you have?" The man kept smiling and answered, "I have 5 dogs, and they really love to play with kids. Do you want to play with my dogs?" Perhaps realizing the man was not going to quit asking us until we agreed to at least see the dogs, we finally agreed to play with them. "Come right over here. They're in the tunnel." The man smiled and stepped back into the tunnel and out of sight. We began walking over to the tunnel. "So, what sort of games or tricks do your dogs do?" I asked as we approached the entrance. Well, as the 3 of us came around and were able to see inside the tunnel, we saw the most vile and disgusting thing any of us had ever seen in our lives. Several dogs, and it looked like much more than 5, were lying dead in a pile in the middle of the tunnel, stacked on top of each other. They had obviously been dead for a long time and reeked, as well as being covered with flies, and were all tattered and decayed, several of them in different stages of decay. The man, however, was standing beside them, and that smile never left his face as he told us, "Well, they only know how to play dead." He then narrowed his eyes and asked for the final time, "Do you kids want to play with my dogs?" Well, needless to say, respect for our elders was thrown out the window. The 3 of us booked out of there like there was no tomorrow, and I heard the man yelling after us, "Come back and play with my dogs, kids. They love children." Well, fortunately for us, the man did not follow us. We were winded long before we made it home, but we did not stop until we got there. That was the last time I ever went exploring at Grandma's. Hide and seek. When I was younger, we used to go to my aunt's house and spend a month or 2 there in the summer. It was a lot of fun. She lived out in the country in a nice, mildly wooded area. It was great for playing things like hide and seek with my one and only cousin. My family lived in the city, and I really would not have had it any other way. But that was what was so great about going to my aunt's house for a month or so. I could have fun in the country without having to actually live there. Well, when I was 14, though, I had an experience there which really soured me on the whole country visit. It was an early July day, and my dad had just dropped me off the preceding day. I had been too tired to really do anything of note when I arrived, but after a good night's rest, I was ready on the second day to go out and play with my cousin. Not surprisingly, we decided to play a game of hide and seek. Yeah, it's pretty weird playing it with only 2 people, but we didn't care. It was fun, and it gave us an opportunity to change the rules up a bit. There was no running back to base to be safe. One of us would count to 100, while the other one hid. The counter, the one who was it, would then have 30 minutes to find the hider. If he was successful, then the hider would be it. If not, we just start a new round. On or about the 3rd round of play that day, my cousin was it, and I ran off to hide. We liked making the game as challenging as possible, so the person who was it would count to 100 as slowly as possible. Then the person who was it would generally walk around and sometimes try to talk to the hider, to make him nervous or get some sort of reaction that would reveal where they were. This time, I ran way off into the woods and soon found myself a big rock to hide behind. It was right beside a depression in which a small creek was running. I had never actually seen it before and figured it must have been a good place to hide in. I didn't think my cousin would ever find me. Well, I seemed like I was right for about 20 minutes. I sat there, watching the water in the creek run. A couple of salamanders were running on the rocks, and I enjoyed watching them. But as I did, I finally heard a noise out in the woods. There was a snapping as if a twig cracked. I grinned, even though I knew my cousin was near. Time was not on his side. "Where are you?" I heard a tiny voice in the distance. He was talking in a high, taunting voice as he always did. "Ollie, ollie, oxen free," he sang in a sing-song sort of tone. "Like I'm gonna come out," I whispered under my breath. I heard his feet as they crunched in the leaves on the ground. They were getting closer to me. I quietly glanced down at my watch, looking to see that I had 5 more minutes before I would win. come out, wherever you are," I heard him call out in the high voice. "I'm gonna find you." The footsteps at first got a lot closer to me, and I felt like I was gonna lose right at the last moment. I grimaced as I expected to see my cousin look around the rock I was hiding behind. I tried my best to hold very still. "Come out," I heard him call. After a moment, though, a tense moment in which I completely expected him to find me, I heard the leaves cracking as he began walking away from me. When I was about to congratulate myself, I felt a vibration in my pocket, and although I jumped at first, I was able to contain myself without making too much noise. My cousin was desperate, and he was trying to call me on my cell phone, hoping the ringtone would alert him to where I was. I quickly grabbed the phone and stopped the vibration, and then I saw it was a text message and not a call. Looking at it, it said, "Scott, I twisted my ankle and had to hobble back home and couldn't look for you. Just come home." I paused, and then I heard the steps coming back towards me. And I heard the voice, which I now knew was not my cousin's, tell me, "Ollie, ollie, oxen free, Scott. Come on out." Whoever it was, not my cousin, but they knew my name. Well, at first I thought it would just be best to wait it out. Whoever it was had come close to the rock before and left. If he kept talking, then I would probably know where he was, and if he came close, I could try to get away. Immediately after thinking that, I heard, "I know you're behind the rock. Come on out, Scott." I heard the crunching noise get closer to me, and I realized that he knew where I was, and I only had one choice. I jumped up, thrust myself forward, and ran like hell without looking back. I never saw who it was, not once. I didn't need to know. I just ran and did not stop until I got back to the house. When I arrived and felt like I was safe, I explained to my aunt what happened, and she didn't let us go out anymore that summer. I told her how strange it was that whoever this man was, he knew my name. And He seemed to be taunting me because he obviously knew where I was hiding, but made me believe that he didn't know. Well, my aunt just seemed disconcerted, but she never really explained why. She just maintained it was best for us to stay inside that summer. The old house. This by far is the weirdest experience I've ever had in my life. I grew up in a military family for the first 12 years of my life. When my dad decided to retire, he bought a house out in rural Tennessee. It was a difficult adjustment for me, but not for the reasons you might think. Being the child of a military officer, I was moved around a lot growing up. It wasn't really difficult moving away from friends or starting in new schools because I'd done it so many times before. The hard thing about the move to the country was that it was complete environmental change. I had previously lived on military bases where there were a plethora of kids to make friends with. My dad bought a house that was pretty well off the beaten path. As I remember, the nearest home was about a half-hour drive away. Although I knew I'd make friends at school, there weren't going to be any kids anywhere around me to hang out with at home. So, I was going to have to find a way to entertain myself. The activity that I found that I enjoyed the most was exploring the woods around the house. I could go out several times a week and just wander around for hours, and I'd rarely go to the same place twice. It was a vast wooded area I lived in, and I enjoyed exploring it. There were creeks and hills and rocks and caves, and I even came across a waterfall once. Well, on this particular day, I had been out exploring for a while, and I actually had gotten lost. That wasn't too much of a big deal because it happened before. I really didn't have any good scouting ability, but usually if I wandered around enough, I would always get back to where I was going. So after a bit of time, I actually came across an old and apparently abandoned house sitting in the middle of the woods. It wasn't the first time I'd come across a building, though. There had been some rundown old sheds and rundown old barns just completely eaten up by the elements. But this was interesting because it was an actual house, and it wasn't as bad off as the other buildings had been. The house itself was a two-story affair, but the roof was pretty much all gone. It was covered in chipped white paint that was peeling off the old brick walls. All of the windows were busted out, which I assumed happened after it was abandoned because it was never boarded up. The front door was long since gone, and there was moss growing on the front of the building in certain areas. Now, I probably shouldn't have, but I immediately wanted to take a look inside this building. Unlike most of the other buildings I come across, it wasn't completely run down. Walking up to it, I walked through the doorway and took in the interior of the front room. It was obviously a living room and even had some extremely worn down and rotting furniture in it. The floor, however, was solid and I walked on it with no problem. Looking up, I saw that there were huge holes in the ceiling and the back wall of the house was pretty much completely gone. Still, I was fascinated. After peeking around at the leftover furnishings and other items, I finally found my way over to the staircase. I pressed my foot against the bottom step and found that it was completely solid. So I began walking up the steps very carefully, each time making sure to test each step before fully putting my weight on it. Each stair creaked, of course, but even though it made me feel completely nervous, I was still somewhat exhilarated. My sense of adventure had been piqued. When I got to the top, I found my heart beating hard in my chest. I looked around to see if any of the rooms had strong enough and solid enough floors for me to walk on. There was one room, that seemed alright, and when I walked into it, I noticed it was a girl's room. Like the other rooms, it still had a lot of furniture in it. I walked over to the vanity, and it had half of the mirror still intact. After looking at my cracked reflection, I looked down at the vanity itself. There were some combs and a brush, and even some hair barrettes lying on the shelf. I fumbled through the items, and then I saw something really strange. There was an old journal lying on top of it. It hadn't been completely destroyed by the elements, so I picked it up and flipped through it. The book itself was really weird. It wasn't really writing as much as it was mostly a lot of stick figure drawings. The majority of them was of a girl. I knew that because she had a little triangle drawn on her for a dress. But there was also a huge thing that was just labeled Daddy. But it wasn't a person, and it wasn't a stick figure. It was a big and vile-looking beast, like something from Where the Wild Things Are. And some of the pictures, the girl was holding his hand, and others, she was running away from it, and still others, she was hiding from it. Well, I just figured if this journal was written by a girl, little girls are pretty imaginative, and that's probably all it was. That's a bit odd, I told myself as I sat the book down. I then heard a strange creaking noise right behind me. Nervous at first, I jumped and spun around behind me, but I didn't see anything. I told myself it was an old house that probably hadn't had anybody in it a long time and was just reacting to me being there. Looking around more, I saw that there was a closet, so I walked over to it. There were a lot of old clothes, little girls' clothes of course, hanging in there, ruined, molded, mildewed. Above the hangers there was a shelf, and I saw some items up there on it. So I stood on my tiptoes and reached my hand up there. As I moved, I inadvertently knocked a tennis ball off the shelf, and it fell to the floor and rolled across the floor to the middle of the room. I went to go pick it up, and as soon as I crouched down next to the bed, I found myself suddenly face to face with a young girl who was obviously hiding under the bed. She was wearing a white dress with a red belt and had a red handkerchief in her hair. She was completely clean and groomed, a stark contrast to everything else that was in the house. She looked me in the eyes, very panicked, and put her finger to her lips and said, "Shh, Daddy's looking for me." I really had no idea what to think, but my fight or flight instinct clicked in and it chose flight. I jumped up, ran to the stairs, got down the entire staircase in 2 huge strides. I jetted out the front door, and I did not look back at that dilapidated house as I ran and ran and ran. Unfortunately, since I just ran aimlessly into the woods, I ended up getting myself even more lost, and it took quite a while for me to get home. But I eventually made it there. The entire time, nervous, looking around, expecting to see the little girl or her daddy somewhere out in the woods. I didn't tell anyone about the experience when I got home. I really didn't know what to think about it. I mean, it wasn't as scary as it was weird. I mean, even if there was no daddy, I saw a young girl hiding under a bed in an abandoned house in the middle of the woods. That was just completely creepy. Needless to say, I never went hiking in that area ever again. Hey, Killer Orange Cat here. I hope you enjoyed the preceding stories, and found them at least a bit scary. I have to admit laughing a little bit when I listened to the tunnel one myself. If you did enjoy it, I invite you to subscribe to my channel, as I will be coming out with at least 2 videos a week of true stories and some creepypasta readings. I've had people ask me to narrate stories of theirs, which I would be more than happy to. I've included my email address in the description for this video. So, I hope that you enjoyed it, and look forward to the next video. And as I always say, check in the closet and under your bed, because no matter how much you want to believe it, you're never truly alone.